Hello, my name is Russell Swanson, and this is a brief recap of my lecture on Plato's Allegory of the Cave from his work Republic. In my last lecture, I offered you a very famous bit of Western philosophy referred to as the Allegory of the Cave, and I gave you kind of an interpretation of that allegory which focuses on the ethical implications of it, i.e. in terms of ancient ethics, this is the implications that the allegory gives us in terms of a good human life and what may represent the highest experiences of a human existence. And what is conveyed in the allegory in those terms complements, I think, the work in Republic that Plato does on his theory of justice. And so in the last lecture, we reviewed this basic structure of the allegory, that there's an inside of the cave, that there's an outside of the cave. And I broke down for you that the inside of the cave represents the less real, less important world. I referred to it as sort of a combination of the cultural realm and the physical world. And that outside the cave represents the more real, more important world. More real in the sense that it is more stable, and more important in the sense of that is where we must turn our mental attentions to this level of reality that's represented by the outside of the cave in order to be able to arrive at knowledge and an understanding of the truth of reality and the stable structures of reality. So we talked a little bit about how these two big parts of the allegory, the inside of the cave and the outside of the cave, are each broken down into two sub-elements, yielding kind of four levels of experience in what might amount to a completely good life, a life that attains the highest level of achievement. And we all start, I would argue, and I think Plato's arguing, at level one, which is inside the cave, in the back of the cave, staring at the shadows on the cave's wall. I talked to you a little bit about how those shadows seem to represent a kind of an insubstantial secondhand account of existence. At some point, we may be forced out of level one. I like to think sometimes that maybe we just get bored with level one, some of us, and we think that there must be something more. And so maybe we turn our attention, or we have our attention turned around, and we take in the cave for the first time via our senses. And in that moment, we turn from shadows to the physical objects and the firelight on the raised platform that was causing those physical objects moving along the raised platform to project shadows on the wall. And that's a big moment of painful disillusionment. Disillusionment sounds bad, but if you break it down, while it is painful, it's kind of necessary that we have our illusions removed. I describe this as kind of a Socratic insight into our own non-knowledge or our own negative wisdom, a realization of what we don't know, and that is an important first step in the search for wisdom in life. However, inside the cave, for Plato, you still can't arrive at any knowledge. You can get a kind of a perspective on the second-hand accounts that you had at level one, but level two at its best is just kind of that perspective on the insubstantiality of the experiences we were having at level one, which at some point in our lives we were totally consumed by. And so the journey must continue in a good human life up and out of the cave, along that difficult passage up and out on the weak legs of a prisoner. It would be a very difficult journey. And in some respects, I think that Plato is talking about the journey of education, although I like to, talk about it as the journey of the development of the mind, whether it happens in the formal education settings or whether it happens outside of those formal settings. It's the journey of the development of your capacity for critical thought, for kind of directed, concentrated, abstract thought and reasoning. And after your ability to develop, after your ability to think critically and logically develops, you emerge out of the cave into level three, where you begin to apprehend the forms and patterns of existence. Remember, there's kind of a strange metaphysical twist here for Plato. It seems strange to us, actually, as a very compelling philosophical position to debate, and that is that Plato believes that outside the cave is a kind of a non-physical realm. Today I'll add, that in some sense that's kind of a spiritual realm. If by spirit we mean non-physical, then this is Plato saying that there's a cultural and a physical realm that's less important, and outside the cave there's a spiritual realm that's more important. Let's also be clear, though, I'm underlying the non-physicality, the lack of material substance in the realm of forms outside the cave, but it's very much an intellectual journey that we're taking here. And so some of the connotations of the word spiritual might be inappropriate in this context. But when we begin to apprehend the forms and patterns of reality, we begin to pay attention to the non-physical commonalities that underlie all the physical objects of existence. So you come to know a single human through your senses, you come to know another single human through your senses, and at some point via your mind and your critical thinking and your logical abilities and abstract thought, you begin to come to know, you begin to formulate the idea of a human being, the form human being, or the pattern human being, or the structure human being. And in this way, you come to know that which is, for Plato, the most real part of reality, the most, ironically, I'll say it this way, the most substantial, the most important part of reality, even though it's not physically real, it's significant to us because that's where knowledge becomes possible, when the mind begins to latch on to these permanent non-physical structures of reality that are the foundation of this sort of copy, as Plato sees it, of what physical reality is. And so in some sense, and I'll use some somewhat provocative language here, we take our minds and we begin to, leave the cultural and the physical and get to sort of this intellectual, spiritual realm, this intellectual heaven, if you will. But it's very much not after you die, right? Like this is all a virtue theory about how you get the most out of life during this lifetime. And if you have developed your critical thinking skills enough, and if you are diligent in your efforts and you have some ability, and importantly, if you have come to know thyself and you have minimized the internal discord and struggles within the self, and you're not overly consumed by appetites or by ambitions, then you can perhaps proceed pretty far outside the cave in terms of what you come to know about reality. I didn't emphasize this in my opening lecture, but for Plato, a big part of sort of getting to the higher levels of understanding would be getting to the mathematical levels of understanding of reality. And that's no accident. Pulling from Mesopotamian and Egyptian sources, the Greeks really take mathematics to another interesting level in terms of abstraction and formalization. And to this day, I hope you know that math, while there is some interesting debate about whether or not it's sort of real or whether it's a kind of a construct of the mind that acts as a tool, for Plato, it very much would represent sort of the structures of reality, and your ability to apprehend the mathematical patterns and structures of reality is where we start to get to the most powerful knowledge. And that's, interestingly true to this day. And by the way, I think that's why Plato regards these non-physical structures, whether they're mathematical or whether sort of the forms of trees and humans and the essences of objects. When we get to this higher level of reality, the fact that these concepts that we have allow us to do things in the world, like build a Parthenon that will last for centuries, if you build it the wrong way, if you don't use math correctly, if you don't adhere to the properties of your materials like the marble, then it will collapse on you and kill you. But if you build it based upon your mind's understanding of the essence of the materials and the mathematical principles that are underlying the construction and engineering of the building, it'll last for a long time, and it won't fall on you and kill you. So in some sense, right, like The mind must be apprehending, Plato concludes, something in the nature of reality itself. Otherwise, why would these ideas work to allow us to do things in reality? And if we continue, if we're diligent, if we have this ability, and if we have found an internal harmony in ourselves, a justice in ourselves, then maybe we will join the ranks of the enlightened few, the philosopher kings and queens, who may one day have a flash of insight, a flash of understanding, as Plato calls it, in which we are able to apprehend the form of all the forms, the structure of all the structures, the pattern of all the patterns of reality. With our minds, in some sense, we're able to connect to and see our place within the unity of existence itself, right? And not only do we understand the structure of all the structures in that moment, Plato somewhat I would say mystically almost claims that we understand the source and the cause behind all reality in that moment. And that's the level 4 experience where we apprehend the sun in the famous, extended metaphor that is the allegory of the cave. Only the enlightened few will get that far in existence. There is no higher achievement. However, in some sense, while there's no level 5 to go to, there is another job to do for the noble, for the enlightened few, and that is to risk themselves and to sacrifice their own happiness, which would be best met, best satisfied by remaining at this level of just comprehending the structures of reality and its source and dwelling upon that. Instead, what we are challenged to do, if we're so lucky and able as to get to that level, is that we should fight our way back down into the darkness in order to try to liberate others, so that we can whisper in some ears that there's so much more to this glorious existence than what you've conceived so far. Okay, so that's a brief recap of my lecture on Plato's Allegory of the Cave, particularly in terms of its implications for the best of human existence. Take care.